I watched Vanessa Kilburn's face drain of color as she burst through my office door, her perfectly styled hair disheveled, mascara smudged at the corners of her eyes. Why did legal flag all our reports? Her voice cracked on the last word, and for the first time since she'd taken over as regional director 3 months ago, I saw genuine fear replace that perpetual smirk. I looked up from my laptop, taking my time to save the spreadsheet I'd been working on. Which report specifically? All of them. Every single quarterly review from the past 6 months. She slammed a stack of papers on my desk, red-flagged sticky notes protruding like accusatory fingers. The compliance team wants explanations by end of day, and corporate counsel is flying in tomorrow morning. I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch. If you've ever been blamed for something you warned people about, you know that particular flavor of vindication, bitter and sweet at once. Lea, I need you to fix this. Her tone shifted to desperation. You know these systems better than anyone. 2 days ago, she'd laughed at me. Actually laughed, that high-pitched trill she reserved for dismissing subordinates. You take integrity way too seriously, she'd said, waving her manicured hand as though my concerns were gnats to be swatted away. Then she'd reassigned my responsibilities to her protégé, a recent MBA graduate named Colin Pierce who nodded along to everything she said and asked no uncomfortable questions. But let me back up. I'd been with FarPoint Technologies for 11 years. My father worked here for 32 before his retirement, back when the company manufactured telecommunications hardware in the building that's now our corporate gym. He used to tell me that integrity wasn't about grand gestures, it was about the small choices you made when nobody was watching. The numbers don't lie, Lea, he'd say, tapping the side of his head. But people do. Your job is to make sure the numbers tell the truth. I started as a junior analyst in the finance operations department, back when we still printed physical copies of everything and maintained paper trails that could survive an audit from any angle. I worked my way up through sheer persistence and an annoying habit of asking questions nobody wanted to answer. Why did these revenue projections include orders that hadn't shipped yet? Why were we categorizing this expense under R&D when it clearly belonged in sales? Why did last quarter's numbers look different in this presentation than they did in the source documents? My previous manager, Helen Yu, valued that quality. She promoted me to senior compliance analyst and gave me increasing responsibility over financial reporting accuracy. You're the conscience of this department, she told me during my last performance review under her leadership. Don't ever lose that. Then Helen retired, and Vanessa arrived from our competitor with a reputation for aggressive growth strategies and a mandate from the C-suite to increase our division's profitability by 20% year over year. She was younger than me by 5 years, credentialed by an Ivy League MBA, and uninterested in anything that sounded like caution. Our first meeting set the tone. I'd flagged inconsistencies in the Q1 projections, revenue recognition that seemed accelerated, expenses that had been reclassified to paint a rosier picture. Standard stuff that needed correction before we filed anything official. Vanessa listened with a frozen smile. I appreciate your diligence, Lea, but we need to think bigger picture here. These adjustments are within acceptable ranges, and they tell the story our investors want to hear. They tell a story, I replied carefully. But it's not the accurate one. Her smile never wavered. Let's discuss acceptable parameters for flexibility in financial narrative construction. That's corporate speak for let's discuss how to make the numbers say what we want them to say. I pushed back, citing GAAP standards and SEC regulations. She pushed harder, citing competitive pressures and market expectations. We reached an impasse, with me refusing to sign off on reports I considered misleading and her growing increasingly frustrated with my inflexibility. The others in the department noticed. My colleague, Daniel Ortega, pulled me aside after one particularly tense meeting. You need to be careful, he warned. She's building a case against you. For doing my job correctly? For being a problem. He glanced around the break room nervously. Colin's been sitting in on all the projection meetings. He doesn't ask any questions. Colin was 26, eager, and ambitious in that hollow way that mistakes compliance for weakness. He'd made a point of introducing himself to all the senior leadership within his first week, armed with ideas about optimizing reporting efficiency that essentially meant cutting corners on verification processes. Vanessa loved him. Over the next 6 weeks, I watched my responsibilities slowly migrate to Colin's desk. First, it was the monthly variance analysis, Colin has some fresh perspectives on how to streamline this process. Then the quarterly reconciliations, we're giving Colin more exposure to high-impact deliverables. Finally, the audit prep coordination, Colin will interface with external review teams going forward. Each reassignment came with a smile and corporate platitude about redistributing workload and developing junior talent. But the message was clear: I was being sidelined for refusing to play along. The final straw came during last week's division-wide meeting. Vanessa presented Q2 results that looked spectacular on the surface: revenue up 18%, margins improved, customer acquisition exceeding targets. The executive team beamed. The sales directors applauded. Everyone congratulated Vanessa on her transformative leadership. I sat in the back, stomach churning, because I'd seen the actual source data. Those numbers were constructed from optimistic assumptions, premature revenue recognition, and creative expense allocation. They weren't lies exactly, more like aggressive interpretations that danced along the edge of acceptability. The kind of thing that might survive a casual review but would crumble under serious scrutiny. After the meeting, I requested a private conversation with Vanessa. I explained, one more time, why I had concerns about our reporting methodology. I offered specific examples. I referenced the relevant accounting standards. I tried to be diplomatic, professional, focused on the work rather than the personalities. She cut me off mid-sentence. Lea, you're a talented analyst, but you lack strategic vision. You're so focused on technical compliance that you miss the bigger picture. She leaned back in her chair, radiating confidence. Successful leaders understand that there's a difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of progress. You take integrity way too seriously. She laughed then, not cruelly, but dismissively, the way you might chuckle at a child who insists on following all the rules during a family board game. I'm reassigning your remaining audit coordination responsibilities to Colin, effective immediately. I need someone in that role who understands how to work with external reviewers constructively rather than treating every question like a crisis. I said nothing. Not because I had nothing to say, the words were there, hot and ready behind my teeth. But because my father taught me another lesson about integrity: sometimes silence is strategy. Sometimes you let people make their choices, document your objections, and wait. So I waited. I went back to my reduced portfolio of responsibilities, now mostly routine data entry and low-level reporting that kept me busy but powerless. I watched Colin prepare for the upcoming audit review, cutting verification steps and accepting source documents at face value. I watched Vanessa coach him on relationship management with the compliance team, emphasizing responsiveness over accuracy. And I kept my own files. Every email I'd sent raising concerns, dated and saved. Every report I'd flagged with recommended corrections, documented and organized. Every meeting note where I'd outlined risks, timestamped and archived. Not because I was planning revenge, I'm not vindictive by nature, but because I knew how these situations typically unfolded. When aggressive accounting eventually collides with regulatory reality, leadership looks for someone to blame. I wasn't going to be an easy target. What I didn't mention to Vanessa, what she never bothered to ask about, was that I maintained relationships throughout the organization that predated her arrival. Including with our general counsel, Stuart Lancaster, who'd worked with my father years ago and who'd specifically told me when Helen retired, "If you ever see something that concerns you, my door is always open." 2 weeks ago, after Vanessa's reassignment became final, I requested a meeting with Stuart. Not dramatically, just a calendar invite marked, compliance discussion, confidential. I brought my documentation. I walked him through the timeline. I showed him specific examples of where our reported numbers diverged from the underlying data, and I explained the methodological shortcuts that Colin had implemented under Vanessa's direction. Stuart listened without interrupting, his expression neutral. When I finished, he asked one question: "Are you confident these issues represent material misstatement?" "I'm confident they represent significant risk," I replied. Material enough that if an external auditor or regulatory reviewer asked the right questions, we couldn't defend our positions. He nodded slowly. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention. Don't discuss this conversation with anyone. Continue your current work as assigned. I'll take it from here." That was 8 days ago. 3 days ago, I heard through Daniel that the external compliance team had arrived early for their scheduled review, unusual but not unprecedented. They'd requested complete documentation packages for all quarterly reports dating back 6 months. They'd interviewed Colin extensively. They'd asked for access to source systems and original transaction records. 2 days ago, Vanessa reassigned my responsibilities with that dismissive laugh, telling me I took integrity too seriously. Yesterday, I watched Colin leave the building mid-afternoon, carrying a box of personal items, his face ashen. Today, Vanessa burst into my office with terror in her eyes, asking why legal had flagged everything. I looked at her across my desk, this woman who'd spent 3 months systematically dismantling the safeguards that protected our company from exactly this situation. Part of me felt sympathy. She genuinely believed she was doing the right thing, optimizing performance, driving results. But a larger part, the part shaped by my father's patient lessons about accountability, felt something colder. The reports were flagged because they contain material inconsistencies with source documentation, I said evenly. The compliance team identified multiple instances of premature revenue recognition, improper expense classification, and inadequate support for projected figures. These issues were introduced over the past 3 months through the methodological changes you implemented. But Colin assured me everything was within standards. Colin didn't know what the standards were. He's smart, and he's ambitious, but he has 14 months of experience. You put him in charge of processes that require years of expertise and careful judgment. I kept my voice level, factual. I flagged these exact issues in writing multiple times. You have my emails. Vanessa's face cycled through emotions: denial, anger, fear, calculation. You did this. You went around me to legal. I raised concerns through appropriate channels when my direct warnings were ignored. That's not going around you. That's following company policy for compliance escalation. I paused. It's literally in the Employee Handbook, Section 12. You sabotaged me. I protected the company. There's a difference. She gripped the edge of my desk, knuckles white. This will destroy my career. Maybe it should. The words came out harder than I'd intended, and I saw her flinch. I took a breath, searching for that space between anger and professionalism. You were hired to improve performance, not to manufacture it through creative accounting. You had multiple opportunities to correct course. You chose not to. What happens now? Now you explain to corporate counsel and the compliance team how these errors occurred. You'll probably want to review my documentation carefully. I've been thorough about maintaining records of our communications regarding these issues. It will help establish timeline and intent. Her eyes widened as the implication landed. Intent. The difference between mistakes and fraud. I'm trying to tell you that if you're honest about what happened, if you acknowledge that you pushed for aggressive reporting against internal warnings, you might survive this as a judgment error rather than deliberate misconduct. But if you try to claim ignorance or blame your team, those contemporaneous emails are going to be very problematic for you. We stared at each other across that desk, the power dynamic inverted from where it had been 72 hours ago. I wondered if she understood yet how thoroughly she'd miscalculated. She'd seen my caution as weakness, my integrity as inflexibility. She'd never considered that those qualities might be armor rather than handicap. Stewart appeared in my doorway, his expression grave. Vanessa, we need you in conference room A. The compliance team has questions. He glanced at me with something that might have been approval or might have been wariness, hard to tell with Stewart. After they left, I sat alone in my office, listening to the ambient hum of the building's ventilation system. My hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline aftermath. The confrontation had been necessary but not enjoyable. I've never liked conflict, even when I'm proven right. Especially when I'm proven right. Danielle appeared with coffee an hour later. The rumor mill is going insane. Is it true Colin's been terminated? I don't know his employment status. That's between him and HR. But the reports were flagged for compliance review. That's all I can say. He studied my face. You knew this was coming. I knew there were problems. I documented them. The rest followed naturally. Naturally. He smiled grimly. Vanessa's in that conference room getting eviscerated, and you're here drinking tea like nothing happened. That's not natural, Lea. That's strategic. Maybe he was right. Maybe my father's lessons had been more tactical than I'd realized. Patience isn't passive, it's preparing for the moment when the truth can't be ignored anymore. Integrity isn't just about being right, It's about being right in a way that can be demonstrated and defended. The investigation took 3 weeks. The compliance team reconstructed our reporting methodology, comparing filed statements to source documentation. They interviewed everyone in the department. They reviewed email communications, meeting notes, approval chains. They built a timeline of how the irregularities had emerged and who had raised objections. My documentation became the backbone of their report. Colin was terminated for cause, though I heard later that it was positioned as resignation to avoid complicating his future employment prospects. He was young and foolish, not malicious. There's a difference. Vanessa was placed on administrative leave, then quietly negotiated a separation agreement. I never learned the specific terms, but she was gone within a month, her LinkedIn profile updated to list her as an independent consultant. Stuart called me to his office on a Friday afternoon, 6 weeks after that confrontation in my office. The board has completed its review of the compliance findings. We're implementing new oversight protocols for financial reporting, including mandatory dual sign-off on all material projections and quarterly compliance certification requirements for department leadership. That's appropriate, I said carefully. We're also creating a new position, Director of Financial Compliance and Ethics. It's a senior role, reporting directly to me with a dotted line to the CFO. The director will have authority to halt any reporting process that raises compliance concerns and mandate for anonymous escalation channels. He slid a job description across his desk. The board would like to offer you the position. I read through the responsibilities, the scope, the compensation. It was a significant promotion, 2 levels above where I'd been before Vanessa arrived. It was also a target on my back for anyone who found compliance inconvenient. Can I think about it? Stuart nodded. Take the weekend. But Lea, the board specifically requested you. They reviewed your documentation, your escalation timing, your professionalism throughout this process. You're exactly the kind of leader we need in this role. I accepted the position the following Monday. My first task was addressing the entire finance operations department. They'd been through hell, leadership chaos, compliance investigation, terminations, uncertainty. They needed to understand what had happened and why, and they needed to believe that the organization had learned from it. I stood at the front of our largest conference room, looking at faces I'd worked alongside for years. Some angry, some confused, some relieved. Daniel gave me an encouraging nod from the back row. 3 months ago, this department faced a choice between accuracy and appearance, I began. Some of us chose accuracy. Some chose appearance. The organization has now made clear which choice aligns with our values and our long-term sustainability. I paused, making eye contact around the room. I'm not here to relitigate the past or assign blame beyond what's already been addressed. I'm here to make sure we never face that choice again, or more precisely, to make sure that when we do face it, the infrastructure and culture of this department makes the right choice obvious and safe. I outlined the new protocols, the escalation channels, the protection mechanisms for employees who raised concerns. I emphasized that compliance wasn't about saying no, it was about finding ways to say yes that wouldn't put the company at risk. Some of you are worried this means more bureaucracy, more delays, more barriers to getting things done, I acknowledged. That's a fair concern. But consider the alternative. We just spent 6 weeks under investigation, we lost 2 leaders, and we're filing amended reports that will raise questions from investors and analysts for the next year. That's what happens when we prioritize speed over accuracy. That's the real inefficiency. Afterward, several people approached me privately. Some apologized for not backing me up earlier when I'd raised concerns. Some thanked me for speaking up when it cost me responsibilities. Some asked how to navigate situations where they felt pressure to compromise. I gave them all the same answer my father gave me: document your concerns, escalate through proper channels, and never sign your name to something you can't defend. Integrity isn't about being popular. It's about being able to sleep at night. The amended filings were published 6 weeks later, restating our Q1 and Q2 results downward by 8% and 12% respectively. The market reaction was predictable: stock price dropped, analyst ratings were downgraded, earnings calls became uncomfortable affairs where the CFO explained our commitment to accounting accuracy and conservative reporting standards. But something interesting happened. Within 2 quarters, the downward revision stabilized, and our subsequent reports showed steady, sustainable growth. Investors who'd been skeptical began describing FarPoint as a company that takes compliance seriously and well-positioned for long-term value creation. Our credibility, initially damaged by the restatements, ultimately strengthened because we'd demonstrated willingness to correct errors rather than defend them. I ran into Helen Yu at a professional conference 8 months after taking the new role. She hugged me tightly. "Your father would be so proud," she said. "You did exactly what he taught you, stood firm when it mattered." "It wasn't heroic," I said. "I was angry. I wanted to be vindicated. That's what makes it heroic. You could have walked away, found a job somewhere else, avoided the whole mess. Instead you stayed and fought for what was right, even when it cost you." She smiled. "Integrity isn't about being perfect. It's about choosing difficulty over convenience when the stakes matter." Looking back now, 18 months later, I understand the situation with more nuance than I did in those heated moments. Vanessa wasn't evil, she was under enormous pressure to deliver results, armed with techniques that worked in her previous role, unaware that FarPoint's culture and regulatory environment required different approaches. Colin wasn't incompetent, he was inexperienced and overpromoted, given responsibilities beyond his current capabilities. Even I wasn't purely righteous, I was angry at being sidelined, motivated partly by vindication, benefiting professionally from their failures. But the numbers don't lie, even when people do. And sometimes the right choice is also the self-serving choice, and that doesn't make it less right. My team now includes 15 people dedicated to financial compliance, ethics training, and reporting accuracy. We've implemented systems that make it harder to accidentally misreport and easier to raise concerns when something looks questionable. We've created a culture where asking uncomfortable questions is valued rather than punished. It's not perfect. We still face pressure to make the numbers look better than they are. We still have leaders who view compliance as obstacle rather than safeguard. We still have moments where accuracy conflicts with ambition. But when those moments come, I think about my father's voice, "The numbers don't lie, but people do." And I think about Vanessa's desperate face when those lies finally caught up with her. And I remember that integrity might be inconvenient in the short term, but it's survivable in the long term in a way that cutting corners never is. Last week, a new regional director started in a different division. Young, ambitious, fresh from a competitor, tasked with aggressive growth targets. I introduced myself during their first week, welcomed them to FarPoint, offered to share lessons learned from our compliance improvements. "I appreciate that," they said politely, "but I've got pretty clear mandate from leadership to shake things up and drive results. I'm sure your team does important work, but I need to focus on performance, not paperwork." I smiled, recognizing that confidence, that dismissiveness. "Of course. Just remember, if you ever have questions about reporting standards or want a second opinion on financial projections, my door is always open." They nodded absently, already moving on to more important conversations. I walked back to my office, sat at my desk, and opened a new documentation file. I titled it with the new director's name and added today's date. The file was empty for now. But I knew, with the patient certainty that comes from experience, that it wouldn't stay empty for long. The pattern repeats because human nature repeats. Ambition outpaces judgment. Pressure overrides caution. People convince themselves that rules are suggestions and that they're smart enough to avoid consequences. And somewhere, every time, there's someone like me, taking integrity too seriously, documenting everything, waiting for the moment when the truth can't be ignored. I've learned not to enjoy that moment when it comes. But I've also learned not to avoid it. Because if people like me don't speak up, if we prioritize comfort over correctness, if we let the numbers lie because it's easier than fighting, then integrity becomes meaningless, just another corporate value statement that nobody takes seriously. My father was right. It's the small choices that matter, the ones you make when nobody's watching. The decision to document that email. The willingness to raise that concern. The courage to say this is wrong even when it costs you. Those choices compound over time, like interest in an account you can't see. And eventually, when the crisis comes, and it always comes, you find that you've built something stronger than convenience, more durable than popularity. You've built a foundation that can withstand scrutiny. A reputation that opens doors when others close. A career that doesn't depend on looking the other way. You've built integrity. And nobody can take that from you, no matter how many responsibilities they reassign.